Huh? I gotta do that. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Energy and Commerce Committee and the Subcommittee on Energy and the Environment. And we welcome you to this very important hearing. And it's important just because of the symbolic nature of today, because with March Madness about to begin, it is important that we keep in mind the need for a level playing field. As we work to get more players in the clean energy game, including wind and solar and new clean tech companies, we cannot afford to simultaneously tilt the playing field against American businesses and manufacturers. This hearing will explore ways to keep all countries economically in bounds in the global challenge to reduce global warming pollution. Global warming does not recognize national borders. CO2 emitted in California has the same warming effect as CO2 emitted in China, Europe, or India. Rising sea levels threaten millions of people across the globe in places as far apart as Bangladesh, Boston, and Shanghai. Global warming highlights that we are, in fact, one world. And just as we are connected environmentally, so too are we connected economically. The actions we take in the United States to curb global warming pollution and create jobs cannot stand alone. A cement factory that emits heat-trapping emissions in the U.S. and then decides to move to Mexico or China in response to our laws would have accomplished nothing to reduce global warming, except perhaps to export jobs and emissions overseas. Thus, in a global economy, we cannot ignore the reality of global emissions, nor the reality of global competition. The subcommittee will hear today about some innovative proposals to address this problem, which is important but manageable. Once you drill down on the facts, it's clear that a relatively small number of industry sectors are highly energy intensive and directly vulnerable to international competition and the effects of that, which are brought about by carbon limits. Those industry sectors include iron, steel, aluminum, cement, glass, paper, and pulp, and basic chemicals. These sectors face international competition and have energy or carbon-intensive production processes. While it is true that these sectors together account for more than half of all CO2 from the manufacturing sector, their overall percentage is modest. The big six energy-intensive industries account for only about 6% of total U.S. emissions. These important industrial sectors, interestingly, constituted a little more than 3% of America's gross domestic output in 2005 and accounted for less than 2% of our jobs. To avoid shipping jobs or emissions overseas, some have suggested requiring that energy-intensive products imported into the United States be accompanied by some kind of fee or surcharge unless the product comes from a country with carbon pollution limits. This approach would put imported carbon-intensive products on the same footing as American-made goods and thus level the playing field. Mr. Marty McBroom of the American Electric Power is here to discuss the tariff allowance proposal his company co-authored with the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. Another way of dealing with potential competitive effects would be to take some of the allowance values from the carbon market and give them to the trade-exposed industry sectors to aid in their transition to a low-carbon economy. I commend the work of Mr. Doyle and Mr. Inslee, who have authored such an approach. Mr. Jack McLachlan, who represents a coalition of energy-intensive manufacturers who favor such an approach, is here to provide his views regarding that strategy. Finally, we should remember that in order to stop global warming, it will be necessary for virtually all countries, particularly industrialized countries, to limit their emissions of carbon pollution. If we are ultimately successful in halting global warming, the playing field will not remain tilted forever. And the best approach for keeping all countries in bounds is to encourage them to permanently match the U.S. by limiting emissions immediately. Only then will it be truly possible for teams and companies from places like China and India or Australia to compete without restrictions on the same court as teams from places like North Carolina or Boston College or the University of Illinois or Michigan State or Pittsburgh or Wisconsin or Texas A&M or Cal Berkeley or the University of Illinois at downstate at Champaign.
Don't forget Penn State won in overtime last night in NIT.
Penn State's in the NIT. Yeah. The University of Pittsburgh is doing well, however, and again, dare I say it, the University of Michigan. So I look forward to all of our witnesses' testimony here today, and that completes time for the opening statement of the chair. We turn and recognize the ranking member, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Upton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to putting my bracket up against yours, so you better get yours done tonight.
You don't happen to pick all Jesuit schools to go all the way, do you? That's never been a winning strategy for me, but I can't break my habit of doing that. So,
glad you pick with your heart, not your head.
Not a good strategy.
Thank you again for having this hearing. I want to appreciate testimony from our witnesses that I looked at last night. But before I begin, I'd like to submit a letter that was submitted to our committee last year from former U.S. Trade Rep Susan Schwab. She wrote that we have serious concerns, particularly the enthusiasm for using import provisions that might be perceived as unilateral trade restrictions directed against other countries to push them to move rapidly to reduce their emissions of greenhouse gases. This approach will take us down a dangerous path and adversely affect U.S. manufacturing, farmers, and consumers, and even cause an all-out trade war where no one wins and everyone loses. History has shown that the U.S. is stronger with a robust manufacturing and industrial base. The jobs and industries that will bear the greatest costs of climate legislation are the same industries that we need to keep in America in order to remain a power on the world stage. These are the jobs that built the middle class, and since 2000, U.S. manufacturing has been struggling. From 2000 to 2008, we lost 3.8 million manufacturing jobs, a decline of about 22%. And at the same time, imports were up 29%, a direct correlation. And my home state of Michigan has been ground zero for these losses. The manufacturing and energy-intensive industrial sectors are highly competitive. More often than not, the cost of energy is the difference between operating in the U.S. and shutting the doors to move overseas. And what happens to our national security when we don't manufacture anything? Well, what happens when we need to order all of our steel and aluminum from China? If we take the wrong legislative path dealing with climate change, we run the real risk of permanently destroying our manufacturing and defense supply chains. And in times of crisis, we will be helpless at the mercy of others. The days of Rosie the Riveter and an entire generation coming together to rebuild our military from the ground up will only be a distant memory. By design, a cap-and-trade scheme works by adding to the cost of energy, and through that, an increase in production costs for energy-intensive industries and manufacturing. There are cost containment mechanisms that will be discussed this morning that may help mitigate some of the increases, but at the end of the day, they won't be enough to save the jobs. And when factories move overseas, the environment is worse for it. Let's take steel. In the U.S., steel producers are the most efficient in the world. On average, American steel makers emit 1.2 tons of greenhouse gases per ton of steel. Compare that to Chinese steel emissions, estimated to be in the neighborhood of 4 or 5 tons of greenhouse gases emitted for each ton of steel that they make. We're not helping the environment by sending industries that operate cleanly and efficiently in the U.S. to a regulation-free China. China is the #1 emitter in the world, with greenhouse gas growth every year that equals the current output of Germany. We shouldn't be tying a hand behind our back. We can reduce emissions and create jobs through other policies, and now is not the time for a costly cap-and-trade system. Closing, I'd like to put the scale of the emissions reductions being called for in these bills a little bit in perspective. These proposals would mean that the U.S. cannot emit more in the year 2050 than we emitted in 1910. That's a pretty daunting task, considering that in 1910 the U.S. only had 92 million people compared to an estimated 420 million that we'll have in 2050, and a per capita income in current dollars of about $6,000. To reach that lofty goal of 80% reduction, emissions from the entire transportation sector would have to drop to zero. Emissions from all electricity generation would have to drop to zero. Then we'd need to reduce the remainder by about 50%. Think about the industries and jobs that we'd have to lose to meet those goals. Can we really succeed as a power on the world stage if we shed these industries? Can our economy recover without those jobs? My guess is that most of us know the answers. Yield back.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Dingell.
I want to thank you for holding this hearing today. It is an important one. As I have said before, you are to be commended for building a strong record as we continue to move towards comprehensive climate change legislation. I'd like to be clear. The U.S. is the largest emitter of greenhouse gases, and we're also the lone superpower. We must also be a leader. That said, we need to make strong action corresponding to ours by developing countries and others if we're to go forward on this. We need this for three reasons. First, without compensating action from developing countries, we simply will not get the reductions that the vast majority of scientists agree we need to achieve to avoid devastating effects of climate change. And I would note that the Senate has already acted on this under the Byrd-Hagel resolution, which passed 95-0, setting out the strong feelings of the Senate on this particular matter. Without corresponding action by developing countries with whom we compete internationally, the relative cost of American goods and services could increase and could cause U.S. industry and jobs to migrate to nations that do not limit their emissions. And I can tell you from discussions with the Chinese and others that this is a very real danger, especially based upon the concerns that I expressed to the Chinese in the meeting at Kyoto. Three, past debate on climate change suggests that the Congress would be unlikely to adopt legislation committing the U.S. to limiting its greenhouse gas emissions in absence of assurances that developing countries will take similar action. And I would note again the Byrd-Hagel resolution that passed the Senate 95-0 on this point. There are two options to ensure mandated reductions in the U.S. will not cause jobs and the emissions associated with them to move to countries with less stringent controls. First, free emission allocation to entities that produce goods sold internationally in internationally competitive marketplaces and whose competitiveness would be sorely affected by a domestic cap-and-trade program. Second is a program of border adjustments, which is commonly referred to as the IBEW approach, which you referred to in your comments. Under this proposal, we would require, through tariffs, border taxes, or other mechanisms, the prices of relevant imported goods to reflect the same price that is included in competing U.S. goods as a result of domestic climate change legislation. Again, you referred to this, and I believe it is an essential part of any legislation which this committee or other committees can and should move forward. I would note that the draft that Representative Boucher and I released last year contains a combination of these two approaches. And it is to be noted that that draft carries the proposals which were made and endorsed and approved by an organization of industry and environmentalists. I would urge my colleagues to take a look at this draft as a reference point. It is critical that whatever approach the committee decides to take, it must be in a manner that is reasonably certain to withstand a challenge before the World Trade Organization, which realistically we must expect to be filed. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today about the two proposals and their WTO compliance. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Great. The gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A theory is a coherent group of general propositions used as principles of explanation for a class of phenomenon. We unequivocally state, mostly on my colleague's side, that global warming is a fact. It is still a theory, and I'd like to submit for a record a story yesterday from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and the headline is University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee study could realign climate change debate. And part of it, what I have highlighted is scientists said that the air and ocean systems of the Earth are now showing signs of synchronization with each other. Eventually the systems begin to couple and the synchronous state destroyed, leading to a climate shift in climate. When this happens, the climate state changes. You go from a cooling regime to a warming regime, or a warming regime to a cooling regime. This way we are able to explain all the functions in the global temperature trend in the past century. The research team has found the warming trend of the past 30 years has stopped. Okay, these are scientists now. The research team has found the warming trend of the past 30 years has stopped, and in fact, global temperatures have leveled off since 2001. Now, I say that to start with the debate of is there a tourney at all and should there be games played. I'm not convinced that there is. The chairman is correct in that cement factories will move. I've already been told that. Iron, steel, manufacturing, it's not the climate provisions, it is the energy costs that will cause them to move. A study of the Warner Lieberman, 1 million jobs lost without carbon, 3 million with carbon. This hearing is avoiding leakage. That's cute for saying jobs will be lost. And I yield back my time.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Doyle.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for having this very critical hearing. I believe the concerns with job and emissions leakage as well as international competitiveness will be one of the key issues we need to address if we're going to be able to successfully pass a climate bill this session. As many of you know, Jay Inslee and I have been working over the past 18 months to put together a comprehensive policy to address this critical question. Our policy, which essentially will pay for the additional cost the bill imposes on these industries, using funds generated through a cap-and-trade program, will go a long way towards addressing the concerns of a specific group of high carbon-intensive industries who have an internationally set price for their product. It should be noted that the European Union has identified similar industries within their Phase 3 cap-and-trade program. The industries we believe should qualify would include steel, cement, aluminum, along with a few others. Our policy, however, Mr. Chairman, will not address every single concern these industries face, and other policies will be needed to complement it. For example, we do not directly seek to address the possibility of a rising cost of natural gas, and other policies within the overall cap-and-trade bill will be necessary to address this very real concern. With that said, though, I believe that our policy is the most comprehensive one yet proposed and look forward to having it included as a baseline provision in the draft bill you are expected to release by the end of the month. Some specific questions do remain as this policy evolves and is integrated into the overall bill. We are limited at this time by a lack of necessary data, but hope that the greenhouse gas registry that EPA is developing will be able to guide this policy in the future. I look forward to working closely with you, Mr. Chairman, as we seek to answer these remaining questions. Although this issue is extremely complicated, our proposal will go a long way towards answering many of the industry's legitimate concerns. And with that, I yield back my time.
I thank the gentleman. The gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Pitts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for convening today's hearing. In a time of economic crisis, it is critical that American jobs are not lost due to an overly burdensome cap-and-trade bill. However, after looking at several studies on how cap and trade will affect employment, I have a hard time understanding how what amounts to a big tax increase won't lead to even more job losses. An EPA analysis illustrates that even less stringent emission-cutting measures than the President's budget will reduce manufacturing jobs by up to 12%. This means 3 to 4 million people will lose employment. A CBO study says that, quote, investors might see the value of their stocks decline and workers could face higher risk of unemployment as jobs in those sectors were cut, end quote. Even if large and high energy intensive industries are given emissions allowances, small business will still be hit very hard as they will have to shoulder the burden of high gasoline and energy prices and higher priced goods. MIT researchers predict that a family's energy bill will increase by $3,128 per year. So not only would Americans lose their jobs, they would be forced to pay much higher household energy bills because of legislation proposed. President Obama acknowledged this in a meeting with the editorial board of the San Francisco Chronicle in January of 2008, when he said, quote, under my plan of a cap-and-trade system, electricity rates would necessarily skyrocket. That will cost money. They will pass that money on to consumers, end quote. Mr. Chairman, we need to carefully consider the negative impact of an overly burdensome cap-and-trade bill that it will have on our economy. And in today's economy, I do not believe it's in the best interest of American families to pass a bill that will cost jobs, raise energy costs, and make their way of life harder and more challenging. I look forward to hearing today's witnesses and yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green. I'm sorry, the gentlelady from California, Ms. Matsui. Excuse me.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much for continuing to tackle this issue and examining the details of how we need to construct an effective and strong climate change plan. As I've said before in this room, Sacramento is seeing the effects of climate change every day, from less snowpack to increased wildfires to water shortages. My constituents who are at the mercy of the Sacramento and American rivers are truly afraid of what will happen if we do not act. However, Sacramento's unemployment is over 10%. I do not need to tell anyone here what more job losses would do. So as we craft this bill, I want to ensure that we incorporate appropriate policy measures that enhance American industry and vitality. The witnesses will be laying out a number of policy options today that I want to further explore as we craft this bill. However, we need to go more in depth on the exact formula for the upcoming legislation. We need to get this right. That is why we want to hear from you, our witnesses, on specifics of what this country needs to do. If we give allocations to carbon-intensive manufacturers, we need to ensure that we do not simply gut our efforts to clean this planet. If we incorporate tax breaks, we need to ensure that they are targeted enough so that companies in need receive help, but also defined in scope so we begin to move to a cleaner economy as a whole. And if we pursue international agreements and border duties, I want to ensure that we fully understand WTO trade implications. Some say the devil is in the details, yet I think a better future is in the details. I just want to make sure we get this right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Great. Gentlelady's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Kentucky.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. We look forward to this hearing and certainly welcome our witnesses today. Yesterday, AP had a story, U.S.-China worlds apart on climate change curbs. And the director of China's climate change office said that China did not want to be held accountable for emissions that it produces to make goods for export. He went on to say that if the U.S. tried to impose tariffs on imports from China or other countries that didn't have mandatory emission controls, that would be unfair and a violation of trade rules and would start a serious trade war. So as we move forward, all of us are very much concerned about the impact on employment and our competitiveness with other countries. So I look forward to these witnesses and yield back the balance of my time.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like to waive my time, but ask unanimous consent to place my statement and also a letter from the American Chemistry Council into the record.
Great. Gentleman may do that. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Washington State, Mr. Inslee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate you holding this hearing. I just consider myself a ditto head for Mike Doyle, so I want to associate myself for his brilliant comments about this amendment we're working on. We've proposed one approach to this, and I just want to note a couple of advantages that of Mike and I's approach that I want to comment on. First, it's clear that we do need to address this issue, and just ignoring it is not a solution. So number one, we've got a proposal addressing it. Two, our proposal is an output-based allocation of these allowances, and I think that's might seem a little technical, but an extremely important part of our proposal, because when you do an output-based allocation, it essentially is an incentive for efficiency. And it gives an incentive for our industry to move to more efficient processes and infrastructure, which will become a great competitive advantage in international competition over the long term. So the way we've structured this, it gives a reason for American industry to become more competitive over time so that we can win those jobs over the long term in international competition. Second, this approach is something we can do now without the necessity of risking trade wars right now. That's something that we always have the option of doing with trade adjustment at the border. We can do this now in a way that I think the testimony today will demonstrate can be helpful to our industries both in the import issue and in the export issue, because our approach will help both in the import and export side of the competitive international markets. Third, we think we're heading in the right direction in figuring out and defining the industries that will be assisted by this. And we're going to continue to work with some of the witnesses and the rest of the stakeholders to define that, but we think we've got a fairly rational way of doing that. So we'll look forward to the testimony today. We have some more work to do and look forward to making the right decisions. Thanks.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Shattuck.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing. I find that this kind of hearing is vitally important for the people of America to understand the implications of the policies we're currently considering. I think everyone understands that the goal of reducing greenhouse gases is well intended, and it is believed that a cap and trade mechanism is one mechanism to get there and worthy of pursuit. The sad thing is that too many people don't understand exactly how that will be applied here in the nation and what consequences it will have. I recently was having dinner with a friend of mine who is deeply involved in the trucking business, and the President's budget had already come out, in which he had made it clear that whatever cap and trade system he imposed, he wanted to have a 100% auction of the initial credits. My friend from the trucking industry did not understand that concept and believed that the initial distribution of the credits was going to be based on historical use, as has been discussed here, and that there would not be an actual auction. I think these are very, very important questions to be discussed and answered here and to be communicated to the American people. If, in fact, the President's proposal that we auction every single initial credit to those industries that need them in order to remain in business, then there will be a vast cost imposed by this program across the economy. Many of my colleagues on the Republican side are calling this a tax. Unfortunately, that may cause some confusion amongst the public because it isn't technically a tax. It's not an additional charge where the money flows directly to the government. However, it is the sale of a new commodity that the government is going to create where the revenues come to the government. And the people need to understand that and need to understand that it will impact literally everything they do, from turning on the lights in their home to the price of a suit to the cost of a sandwich. And whenever this Congress proposes to enact new policies, we need to both make clear the goal those policies intend to address and also the consequences of those policies. I think that the American people deserve to know precisely what the cost of this policy will achieve and also what danger it will alleviate or purportedly alleviate before we impose, particularly on a down economy, a new policy of this size which could have vast consequences across the entire economic structure. So I thank the Chairman for holding the hearing.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that you're holding this hearing because it's an important issue. I think global warming has a tremendous potential for us to become more efficient, for us to create new industries and new jobs, but there's downsides or potential downsides. As my colleague right here next to me mentioned, I have unemployment as high as 18% in parts of my district, so losing jobs is the last thing that I want to see happen. And I think if we look at Mr. Doyle and Mr. Inslee's proposal carefully, look at all these things carefully, we can come up with a good policy that will protect American jobs and accomplish the critical goal of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, and at the same time create a whole new sector of jobs. So let's look at this with an open mind. I certainly look forward to seeing what the committee is going to say after having read their testimony, and with that, I yield back to the committee.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Blunt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With unanimous consent, I'll place a statement in the record.
Great. Chair recognizes without objection, so ordered. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Scalise.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll waive an opening statement. And oh, I'm sorry,
Mr. Scalise.
Forgot we got two from Louisiana now.
I'll speak for both of us if it'll be your time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and want to thank the witnesses for also appearing before our subcommittee. Serious issues surround global climate change policy, issues that spread throughout our country and touch every American family. Efforts to tax carbon emissions could cause serious, possibly irreparable harm to our national economy, not to mention that our country's efforts could be in vain if other countries like China and India do not follow a similar strategy. A strong economy includes a strong energy sector, and this subcommittee must be very careful not to pass an energy tax that will have a negative immediate and long-term effect on the health of our national economy while adding more than $1,300 to every American family's energy bill. The dislocation of American businesses and American jobs is a strong possibility if Congress passes legislation that will make it unrealistic and economically unfeasible to remain in our country. Some estimates reach as high as 7 million jobs lost in America if we pass a cap-and-trade tax, as was proposed in the 110th Congress. Add to that the fact that some geographical regions of our country will suffer disproportionate and devastating economic losses if such legislation were to become law. In addition, to take certain forms of clean, renewable sources of energy like nuclear off the table for consideration only adds insult to injury. As I've reiterated in past hearings, it is imperative that we consider these realities as we consider these policies. Instead of Washington bureaucrats mandating harmful policies that will kill key sectors of our national economy, we should instead explore policies that encourage investment in cleaner technology and innovation in the private sector. The ingenuity of the American entrepreneurial spirit is what has made our country the best in the world, and this Congress would be wise to encourage more of that entrepreneurial spirit rather than running off with harmful energy tax policies, that same spirit. The effect of a cap-and-trade tax are broader in scope than some in this Congress want to admit to the American people. Such legislation will ship American jobs overseas, will make heating and cooling our homes much more expensive, and will increase the cost of everyday household products. I would urge caution as we proceed with a cap-and-trade plan and make sure that we fully explore these adverse effects that such a policy would have on American jobs and American families. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Wisconsin, Ms. Baldwin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our nation is a lone superpower in an increasingly interconnected and interdependent world. With this stature comes the unique responsibility to set an example, to model behaviors that we want other nations to emulate. It is true that emissions are rising fastest in developing countries. China's emissions are projected to continue rising rapidly, up 71% by 2020. India is in a similar situation, with emissions projected to continue rising up to 68% in that very same time frame. But we cannot use the behavior of developing nations as an excuse for our inaction. Rather, we must demonstrate by our own example that it is possible to rise to the challenge of creating efficient, effective, and environmentally friendly climate change programs, which in turn will create jobs in a new green economy. However, we have a responsibility to our nation, our businesses, our workers, our consumers, our constituents, to ensure that American industries remain competitive, that American jobs and the production of products remain right here in this country, and that prices and costs remain reasonable and affordable. In Wisconsin, our many energy-intensive manufacturers face tough international competition, particularly from businesses located in countries that have not committed to regulating emissions. To ensure that we do not unjustifiably disadvantage our domestic manufacturing base, we must examine ways to minimize the costs of cap-and-trade compliance and do everything that we can to prevent the loss of U.S. jobs to less or unregulated countries. I recognize this issue is complex, but there are policy options for mitigating potential competitiveness impacts and encouraging developing countries to curb their greenhouse gas emissions. And I look forward to this challenge. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I welcome our witnesses.
Great. Gentlelady's time has expired. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Stearns.
Good morning, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think we're hearing on this side that we're going to lose jobs when we hear the gentlelady just talking about this is going to create jobs. So I think we got a disconnect here, Mr. Chairman. Maybe you can be the referee here, but when we look at some of the, for example, the National Association of Manufacturers, they estimate that a cap-and-trade scheme will cost up to 4 million jobs. The Heritage Foundation, who estimates the loss of up to 5.3 million jobs, or the Charles River Associates estimate that the job loss could be as high as 7 million. So there seems to be a consensus on our side, we're going to lose jobs, and yet you indicate we're going to gain jobs. Now, Mr. Whitfield, in his opening statement, pointed out what China said. China does not want to become a low-carbon society. In fact, they don't want to have any kind of this cap-and-trade part of their export process. And their individual who is the director of China's climate change office said it would be a disaster and possibly the start of a trade war for the U.S. to impose tariffs on imports from China and other countries that didn't have mandatory emission control. So I asked the gentlelady, in light of all the statistics and the groups that I see here, in light of what China said, it's hard to believe that this cap-and-trade is going to create more jobs. In fact, it appears to be, the consensus is, an industry where the jobs are created, it's going to lose jobs. The massive new regulatory burdens imposed by a cap-and-trade will inevitably undercut the growth and innovation we desperately need to build lasting and effective solutions, fostering technology and scientific research, not capping the economy and trading U.S. jobs, will obviously guard our security, increase our energy independence. And so, Mr. Chairman, I look forward to the witnesses, and I just think there is another way to go. Thank you.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Melanson. Gentleman from Louisiana.
See, you tried to catch me twice. I'm going to waive my opening statement.
Great. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Barrow. Okay, the chair sees the gentleman from Oregon. I'm sorry. Chair sees the gentleman from Texas, the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Barton, and recognizes him for an opening statement.
Good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and we appreciate the opportunity to have another dialogue today about climate change. In a global economy where any producer is just an airplane ride away from any customer and boundaries don't seem to matter, the United States does need a competitive edge. Our edge is individual creativity, freedom, an educated and dedicated workforce, and an energy policy, at least until now, based on free markets and supply and demand and least cost. Unfortunately, we have an unemployment rate that's going up, not down. It just hit 8.1%. And it appears that there is a congressional majority determined to adopt a carbon cap and trade policy that is absolutely the worst thing we could be doing right now to protect the jobs that we still have in our economy. We can debate the ins and outs all we want, but if you really want to stop job leakage, don't do cap and trade. It's that simple. We cannot escape the unassailable truth that if you're trying to cap carbon, which is one of the most ubiquitous elements in the world, it's going to put a price on it. It's going to go up, and if the price causes it to go up, jobs are going to go down. It's that simple. Manufacturers compete globally. The cost of energy has a bearing. Whether we manufacture or create that energy, produce that energy in the United States or in China, Mexico, or Brazil. If consumers can just as easily import steel, concrete, and other energy-intensive goods from our competitors, then American producers won't be able to add the cost of greenhouse gas permits to their bills without losing that competitive edge. Everyone knows what happens next. Declining revenues push companies to close facilities in the United States and cut American jobs. I have a factory in my district in my small hometown of Ennis, Texas, about 15,000 people, that has been there for 60 years. They announced 2 weeks ago they're closing the factory and moving it to China. They make mattress box springs. They've been doing it for 60 years in Ennis, Texas, but sometime next year they're going to start doing it somewhere in China. We are naive if we think that China and India and other emerging industrialized countries will sacrifice their own growing economies and their own jobs in response to a theory that has yet to be proven. It just won't work. So, I look forward to this hearing. I know most of the witnesses on a personal basis. They're all good people. And I'm sure we're going to have a good dialogue, Mr. Chairman. With that, I yield back.
Yeah. Great. And the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Walton, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to touch on two topics this morning. Before I get into my views on on the cap and trade proposal, I'd just like to draw to your attention and that of the committees that apparently in the stimulus bill, there was a provision I think a lot of people supported to encourage people to install new energy-efficient windows and get a tax credit for it. The House passed a version that was logical, reasonable. Senate did as well, but somewhere in conference, new standards got put in place that's been brought to my attention would make the cost of these windows exceed any logical ability for anybody to make a decision to go get them, which negates the whole idea of energy efficiency and stimulative effect. And I draw that to your attention, Mr. Chairman, because I hope we can look into this problem and correct it. Apparently, this was something parachuted in conference. It sets such a high standard that instead of a $400 or $500 window, it would be a $1,500 window. And so people aren't going to take advantage of either the incentive or the energy reduction. And so I draw that to your attention, and I would hope we could find out how that happened and its impact. Regarding cap and trade, I'm deeply concerned about the $646 billion tax increase this represents. When a number of us on this side of the aisle met with industry leaders from U.S. CAP, I posed the question, if we create a cap and trade system that means higher energy costs, will you commit not to take your jobs to cheaper energy places that don't play by these rules? And not a single corporate executive would agree to that request. I think that's all that needed to be said on that point. It's very disturbing what it'll do to our economy at a time of great job loss, to increase taxes and to drive more jobs overseas. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and congratulations for getting the television cameras back on. This is great. I want to thank you for holding this hearing, and thank you for allowing us to have some time to talk about cap and trade and the effect that it may have on employment, and also the potential effect that we could have of moving more energy-intensive industries and jobs from America to countries with less stringent emission requirements. Saving jobs and creating new economic growth is something that I hope that we could accomplish at this committee. I don't think we can overlook the fact that these new jobs are likely to be at the expense of good jobs in energy-intensive industries or in small businesses that do not qualify for allocations or protection from higher energy costs. Taxing greenhouse gas-intensive imports will not be an effective way to limit job loss. Consider the impact of the United States' attempts to induce foreign countries into unfavorable trade agreements. It could possibly incite other trade difficulties, or at least exchanges of harsh words over trade balance. Either way, our nation's global position and reliance on trade is too important to risk without a serious cost-benefit analysis, and to date I don't think I've seen one. Shifting import taxes upon countries of origin will only make American products more expensive. Companies are in business to make money. The rest of the world develops. Export-rich companies will simply sell wherever the best opportunity is for profit. If you're looking to sell a product, realistically, would you look toward a company that's in recession and stacking on excessive trade barriers and forcing industries to buy carbon credits to cover emission? It's not likely, especially when there are major emerging alternatives. In the end, globalization of trade markets is based upon getting around barriers such as taxes to lower production costs and ultimately the prices that consumers pay. If there's a way to get around taxes and continue to emit in order to achieve higher prices, I suspect people will find a way. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. The chair sees no other members of the subcommittee, but he sees Mr. Terry, a member of the full committee, who is visiting us, and we welcome you, sir. So we'll turn to our witness panel, and I would ask the witnesses to please move up to their assigned spots at the witness table. And I will introduce our first witness, who is Mr. John McMacken. Mr. McMacken is here today on behalf of the Energy Intensive Manufacturers Working Group on Greenhouse Gas Regulation. Members of that group include many major corporations: Alcoa, Corning, Dow, Holcim, U.S., Nucor, Owens Corning, Rio Tinto, U.S. Steel, Owens, Illinois. We welcome you, Mr. McMacken, and if you could move that microphone in a little bit closer. Whenever you're ready, please begin.
Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee, it's an honor to be here.
That microphone just in a little bit closer.
The Energy Intensive Manufacturers Working Group on Greenhouse Gas Regulation, on whose behalf I appear today, greatly appreciates this opportunity. And we thank you and all the members of the subcommittee and staff who are devoting so much time and energy to this critical issue. I am Jack McMacken, and I am a principal in the law firm of Williams & Jensen and a director of Owens, Illinois. OI, headquartered in Perrysburg, Ohio, and with facilities in 11 states, is the world's largest manufacturer of glass containers. Our group was formed last year for a narrow but important purpose: to engage constructively with the other stakeholders and Congress to attempt to solve what is often referred to as the carbon leakage problem, but which, as the title of today's hearing indicates, is a problem of the leakage of carbon and of jobs. It is a problem that primarily affects energy-intensive industries that face foreign competition, the two factors that define our members. Our working group is composed of companies from U.S. industries that are widely and correctly seen as most vulnerable to leakage. That's ferrous metals, iron and steel; non-ferrous metals, aluminum and copper; cement; glass, including fiberglass; ceramics; chemicals; and paper. As the chairman indicated, the companies include Alcoa, Corning, Dow, Wholesome U.S., NewPage Corporation, Nucor, Owens Corning, Owens Illinois, PPG, Rio Tinto, and U.S. Steel. Let me very briefly highlight 5 points from my written testimony. First, of the 2 types of leakage solutions that have appeared in legislation to date, our group is focused exclusively on the allowance allocation type provisions that attempt to address the root cause of the problem by mitigating the cost differential that unilateral legislation would otherwise impose on U.S. production relative to unregulated foreign producer. Last year's Inslee-Doyle Anti-Carbon Leakage Act, which was largely adopted by the Dingell-Boucher discussion draft, is a prominent and, in our view, very promising instance of this type of measure. Second, the other type, the border equalization provisions that Mr. McBroom will testify about, take a different approach. Rather than mitigate the cost differential through free allocations or allocation value rebated, border equalization provisions attempt to impose comparable costs on competing goods at the border. Our group's focus, as I said, is exclusively on the first form of relief, but let me say this, they are not necessarily incompatible. It is possible to do both, and indeed most of the measures today, the bills that have been introduced, have contained both. Third, the Inslee-Doyle output-based rebate represents a real breakthrough. Let me just talk about 2 of its key attributes, and here I'm echoing the comments of Mr. Inslee. A, by basing its allowances on actual production rather than historic emissions, it removes a significant disincentive to additional production and eliminates the possibility of a windfall. B, by including in its calculations an efficiency standard measured by sectoral average efficiency, it in fact creates a powerful efficiency incentive and establishes a standard that gets tougher every year as the more efficient press their advantage and the less efficient strive to close the gap. Fourth point, there are several important remaining issues, but the single biggest issue requiring further work, in our view, is eligibility. As introduced last year, the Inslee-Doyle bill left the determination of eligible sectors or subsectors up to EPA, subject to a series of generalized standards aimed at assessing leakage potential. No given industry could know the outcome of an ultimate EPA determination, a determination that could be preceded by warring economists and conflicting pricing models. Nor could any member of Congress know whether key industries in his or her district would get relief or not. By contrast, most of the other legislative proposals, including Lieberman-Warner, the Boxer substitute, and the Brown-Stabenow amendment on the Senate side, and the Dingell-Boucher discussion draft, have straightforwardly listed the legislatively determined eligible industries, each proposal containing almost exactly the consensus list of industries represented by our working group members. Fifth, and lastly, a very workable and reasonable solution, a middle ground to this eligibility issue, is emerging and is under consideration by Congressman Inslee and Doyle, and we commend it to the examination of others. Moreover, our group unveils today a study by FTI Consulting, attached as Attachment A to my written testimony, that we hope will help all concerned to better understand and better evaluate this proposed solution and the general issue of which industries should be eligible for relief. Building on the EU approach and work done by the World Resources and Peterson Institutes and many others, the proposed solution would establish objective criteria for energy intensity and trade exposure. Industries that met both of these thresholds would be presumptively eligible to receive allowances. They could be refused relief only if the administrator found that they are not subject to significant leakage. Sectors that did not meet the thresholds could still establish their qualification by individuated showings that they are subject to leakage.
If you could summarize, please, Mr.
Let me say in summary then, Mr. Chairman, that the overall results show that about 45 out of the 473 six-digit code subsectors would qualify. They represent about 8%, Mr. Chairman, of direct emissions in comparison, I think, to the 6% figure for the 6 industries, and that does include process emissions. So we very much look forward to discussing the study with all concerned and to working with the subcommittee, Congressman Isley and Doyle, and all other interested members and stakeholders to build on the remarkable progress to date in fashioning a workable solution to the leakage problem.
Thank you, Mr. McMacken, very much. Our next witness is Mr. Martin McBroom. He is the Director of Federal Environmental Affairs at American Electric Power, which owns the nation's largest electricity generation system. We welcome you, Mr. McBroom. Whenever you are ready, please begin.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman.
On your microphone, please.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and distinguished members of the subcommittee. I am Director for Federal Environmental Affairs of American Electric Power. Headquartered in Columbus, Ohio, AEP is one of the nation's largest electricity generators and serves more than 5 million retail consumers in 11 states in the Midwest and South Central regions of our nation. AEP was one of the earliest companies to publicly endorse actual cap-and-trade legislation. We are committed to working with you to pass federal legislation that is well thought out, achievable, and reasonable, which includes requirements that are timed to coincide with the development of advanced technology and which would allow AEP to recover costs for deployment of advanced technology. Any domestic greenhouse gas reduction program must be coupled with effective international measures to ensure that rapidly developing nations such as China and India also promptly address this problem. If such a provision is not included, we will not succeed at curbing global loadings of greenhouse gases. If fast-developing countries do not curtail their emissions, then U.S. legislation will succeed only in pushing U.S. production and jobs abroad, undercutting and possibly worsening the environmental objective. That production shift is of concern to AEP because 38% of our generation serves industrial customers who could be impacted. When factories move overseas, AEP loses industrial customers, and our residential customers who work in those facilities lose jobs and their families are imperiled. Recognizing that trade is a key component in effective climate change legislation, Mr. Edwin D. Hill, International President of the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, and Michael G. Morris, Chairman, CEO, and President of AEP, jointly proposed in February 2007 a means to effectively leverage U.S. climate negotiators to help them ensure that developing countries also limit their greenhouse gas emissions. We applaud your decision, Mr. Chairman, to include the IBEW-AEP proposal in the climate bill you introduced in the last Congress. We urge you and your colleagues to do so again this year. Simply put, the proposal serves as a backstop for U.S. climate negotiators and complements other provisions that Congress is contemplating to ensure that U.S. climate legislation does not inadvertently undercut U.S. competitiveness. The IBEW-AEP proposal works in concert and is complementary with granting free domestic allowances to industries impacted by competitiveness, and we believe both approaches should be supported by the committee. But only the IBEW-AEP proposal provides direct leverage to shape the behavior of the largest emitting developing countries. And the IBEW-AEP proposal is the one backstop that will remain, no matter what the outcome of international negotiations might be with regards to fast-developing countries, and regardless of whether free allowances are phased out or auction revenues are used for other big-ticket budget priorities. The IBEW-AEP proposal will remain. For those reasons, industry needs both. America needs both. The IBEW-AEP proposal creates the possibility that the U.S. government could require importers of carbon-intensive goods to submit international reserve allowances just as producers of U.S. goods must, unless the exporting country acts to address emissions in a fashion that is comparable to that of the United States. If the IBEW-AEP proposal is successful, then the allowance requirement would likely never need to be applied to imported goods. Instead, fast-developing countries would agree to take effective action to also reduce their emissions. This proposal recognizes that some governments might not act or might act ineffectively. The IBWAP proposal affords Congress the assurance that at least the exports of carbon-intensive goods from such countries would not escape the regulatory impact of the overall federal program. That is only fair. The United States has taken similar action on imports in the context of other conservation and environmental programs. Those measures were reviewed by GATT and WTO panels. The IBWAP proposal respects the jurisprudence that has emerged to ensure that Congress could deploy these measures in conformity with our international obligations. Mr. Chairman, AP believes that our proposal will be helpful to you and your colleagues to ensure developing countries actually join with America in meeting the climate challenge. Thank you again for this important opportunity to testify. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. McBroom. Our next witness is Mr. Paul Ciccio. He is the President of Industrial Energy Consumers of America. He has represented the interests of a variety of industries and consumers, National Coal Council, the National Association of Manufacturers, and others. We welcome you, Mr. Ciccio. Whenever you're ready, please begin.
Thank you, Chairman Markey and Ranking Member Upton and members of the committee. Attached to our written testimony are 6 policy recommendations that would have a significant impact on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and we urge you to work with us to do these things today. There's no reason to wait on those policies, and they will help manufacturing competitiveness. For the industrial sector, climate policy is also a trade policy. It's energy policy, economic, and it is also employment policy. They are all linked, and they are all inseparable. It is for this reason that regulating greenhouse gas emissions for the industrial sector should be negotiated between developed and developing countries in the context of fair trade and productivity, and not act unilaterally. The international agreement should be negotiated first, and U.S. industrial emissions regulated second. Regulating the industrial sector in advance of negotiations removes our leverage. President Obama rightfully points to the disappearing middle class as troubling. We agree. The U.S. began to lose the middle class when we began to lose competitiveness of the manufacturing sector. The timing is absolutely consistent. Let's just look at the facts. Please, okay, chart number 1. Chart number 1, since 2000, U.S. manufacturing has been losing competitiveness and jobs. From 2000 to 2008, imports are up 29%, and manufacturing employment fell by 22%, a loss of 3.8 million jobs. What is not included is the hundreds of thousands of jobs that have been lost this year. Chart number 2. Chart number 2 simply extends the trend of job losses forward to 2012. And unless Congress and we, the industrial sector, work together to stem these losses, a simple extension of those job losses says that we're on track to lose another 2 million jobs by 2012. Chart number 3. Chart number 3 plots investment in industrial equipment in the United States as a share of GDP from 1990 to 2008. This slide illustrates that companies have consistently invested less and less in this country. The only conclusion one can draw from this chart is that the U.S. has not been an attractive place to invest. And to the point of this hearing, placing new carbon costs unilaterally on us will only make things worse. Chart number 4. Chart number 4 shows emissions of each sector of the economy. The industrial emissions are only 2.6% above 1990 levels, while the other 4 sectors of the economy are an average of up 31%. The industrial emissions are low because of plant shutdowns, job losses, and because of the continuous improvement to improve energy efficiency. As you can see, industrial emissions are not a problem. Most importantly, the Congress has a choice to make as it considers imposing an economy-wide cap-and-trade regulation. It must decide whether to maintain and possibly increase U.S. manufacturing jobs by not unilaterally imposing greenhouse gas costs, or you can do so, but it'll create jobs in foreign countries and increased imports. The decision actually, in our view, should not be hard because there is very sound economic and environmental justification for Congress to act in the short term to not do so. But we do urge you to act to forge an important and different policy path that will provide sustained and significant greenhouse gas reductions globally by harnessing real market forces and competition. We need U.S. leadership to forge a global effort to address industrial sector greenhouse gas emissions that is focused on fair trade and productivity. This is the only way to potentially bring developing countries to the table. Productivity is a language that all manufacturers around the world understand and is fundamental to competition. We believe that all governments want productivity by their industrial sectors, so this is a win-win. In summary, the industrial sector needs a level playing field. Adding costs unilaterally helps all of our competitors around the world and takes our business and our jobs. However, if the U.S. proceeds to cap industrial greenhouse gas emissions anyway, despite our plea, we urge you to provide free allowances equal to the resulting direct and indirect costs due to greenhouse gas regulations until major competing countries have similar cost increases. The decision is yours to make. Unfortunately or fortunately, company CEOs have responsibilities to their shareholders to protect company interests, and they will. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ciccio. We appreciate that very much. I can actually see out in the audience we've been joined by former great Republican Congressman Sherry Bollert, and we thank you for coming here. And we wish nothing but the worst for the New York Yankees this year, okay? So at least from this seat. We welcome you. Thank you for being here. Our next witness is Dr. Margot Thorning, Senior Vice President and Chief Economist with the American Council for Capital Formation, which promotes cost-effective environmental policies in the United States and abroad. If you can move that microphone in. Whenever you're ready, please begin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Upton. Thank you, members of the committee, for allowing me to appear before you. I'm Margot Thorning, Chief Economist, Senior Vice President with the American Council for Capital Formation. I respectfully request my testimony be submitted for the record.
Without objection, it will be.
I'd like to make 4 points. First, policies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, such as were debated last year in Congress with the Lieberman-Warner proposal or the new Obama administration proposal, are virtually certain to reduce jobs and to increase unemployment. I draw your attention to Table 1 of my testimony, which presents a survey of different modeling results on the Lieberman-Warner bill from the ACCF NAM study, Charles River, the Energy Information Administration, the Environmental Protection Agency, and MIT. There is a range of estimates for the impact of the loss of jobs and GDP, which in 2020, the lowest is 0.7% of GDP. The highest from EPA is 1.5% loss in GDP. Job losses in 2020 range from 270,000 fewer jobs to as many as 3.2 million fewer jobs. And these modeling results do take account of new green jobs that are brought about as we move more into renewables and alternative technologies. By 2030, the results are even more striking. So I think the evidence suggests that cap-and-trade proposals such as are being discussed now will certainly have a negative impact on U.S. employment and job growth and will speed leakage of jobs abroad. Second point, the Obama administration's revenue estimates are seriously understated. Their new budget suggests that the revenue yield from carbon allowance auctioning would be about $80 billion a year. I believe that's a serious understatement. We looked at the numbers that the Energy Information Administration released last year when they analyzed the revenue yield of the Lieberman-Warner bill, which is not that different from the Obama administration proposal in terms of ultimate targets. As you see in Figure 3 in my testimony, the blue bar is the estimate of $675 billion over the 2012-2019 period that the Obama administration says their cap and trade proposal would bring in. EIA's estimates, we recalculated EIA's numbers on Lieberman-Warner, assuming 100% auctioning. Those numbers, the hash mark numbers, are significantly higher, 3 to 4 to 5 times higher than the yield that the Obama administration is showing. We then recalculated using the lower initial targets in the Obama plan, which is the red bars in my Figure 3. Those show revenue costs to taxpayers and business of 3 to 4 times higher. So I'm guessing that actually the Obama plan would bring in $1 trillion to over $3 trillion over the 2012-2019 period. So that's a very significant cost and would have the impact, of course, of slowing job growth and GDP growth. And in fact, the administration recognizes that. If you look at their budget, page 129 of their budget, footnote 5 says that if additional revenues are raised, those will be rebated to the public. So it's clear they know that the 100% auctioning proposal they have would yield much more revenue. Third point, the environmental benefits of achieving the Obama plan or the Lieberman-Warner plan are very small. And if you talk about cost-benefit analysis, I think a look at the table that the administration released in their Council of Economic Advisors report, which is Figure 5 of my testimony, the administration says that if we achieve the Lieberman-Warner targets, which again are similar to the Obama administration, by the end of this century there will be virtually no environmental benefit. So if you look at costs and benefits, it's clear that going it alone is not likely to yield any meaningful environmental benefit, but it will impose significant costs. Final point, there are positive strategies that the U.S. can adopt to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. There are things we can do here. I commend you to look at Table 2 of my testimony, which shows how slow the capital cost recovery is in the U.S. for new energy investments. Our Ernst & Young study, which is on our ACCF website, shows that the U.S. has the worst capital cost recovery and the highest effective tax rate on new energy investment of major industrial countries. We could also continue to promote the international cooperation that previous administrations have started through the Asia-Pacific Partnership, the Global Nuclear Energy Partnership, Clean Technology, and the Major Economies Initiative. These international agreements are designed to promote technology transfer. Finally, if we do impose a mandatory regime, I would suggest a carbon tax rather than a cap-and-trade system would provide more certainty to the business community and households than the cap-and-trade. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Thorning, very much. Our next witness is Dr. Richard Morgenstern. He is a senior fellow at Resources for the Future. His research includes work on economic analysis of environmental policies. Prior to joining Resources for the Future, Dr. Morgenstern was a senior economic counselor at the Department of State and participated in the negotiations of the Kyoto Protocol. So we welcome you, sir. Whenever you're ready, please begin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to appear here and address you and members of the committee. I would note for the record that Resources for the Future is both an independent and nonpartisan organization, and the views I present here today are mine alone. I would like to summarize a few basic points in my written testimony. First of all, the aggregate impacts of proposed legislation are relatively small. Using the Lieberman-Warner bill as a benchmark, the Energy Information Administration has estimated GDP reductions in 2030 that range from 0.3 to 0.8% of GDP, and 2030 is a time period where GDP levels are expected to approximately double over today's levels. There are other modelers besides EIA who have other results. Some are similar and some differ. I would note that the ones that differ usually, or not usually, but in fact, the differences are related to 3 factors. Number one, that other modelers have much more conservative assumptions about technology development than the Energy Administration. Secondly, other modelers ignore domestic and or international offsets, which are in fact a part of most of the bills. And thirdly, other modelers ignore the banking of allowances, which is in fact a basic proposition in all the bills. So these are factors which can influence model results, and you can see significant differences along these lines. Secondly, despite the small aggregate impacts of these legislation on the scale of Lieberman Warner, there are potentially significant employment and output effects in some industries, particularly energy-intensive, trade-sensitive industries, as this committee is well aware. Third, modeling analysis by myself and others indicates that the impacts decline over time as firms adopt new technologies, they change processes, they vary outputs. So some of the impact numbers we see are based upon initial impacts and do not always reflect these changes. Additionally, I would note that the modeling that's been done, including my own, is based upon unilateral action. And this is a convenient technique we use in doing calculations, but in fact, other countries are adopting, certainly the Europeans are adopting changes, and in all likelihood, the estimates generated by this modeling approach of unilateral action overstates the impact on United States industry. Fourth, a key challenge to this committee and to all of us is to identify particular industry segments that are most affected. Calculations that I've done suggest that when you look at a broad industrial category, typically referred to as a 2-digit industrial category, you can see within that category variation that can vary by a factor of 10. So different sub-elements of broad categories of industries can have quite different impacts, and that is a challenge in devising appropriate remedies. And fifth, emissions leakage is clearly a concern in some industries, and this is particularly a concern over the long term. Turning to possible solutions, there are basically 2 approaches to address this problem. One approach is to exempt certain industries or provide special regulations for them. And the second approach is to try to level the playing field between domestic and international competition. And the mechanisms for that are the border tax mechanisms that have been referred to, or free allowance allocation. As regards exemptions, this was tried in the BTU tax days that were back in the days when President Clinton introduced this notion. And other than simplicity, I would say this approach has very little to recommend it. It ignores some low-cost reduction opportunities that exist in some industries. It makes CO2 reductions more expensive for others, and it encourages what we call rent-seeking behavior, which is not justified by the facts. Turning to the border tax and free allocation mechanisms, they are both contained, as you've discussed, in several bills. The emphasis to put on one versus another depends on several factors. Trade law is certainly a big issue. I'm not a trade lawyer, but I do read the literature on this subject, and certainly many have raised questions about the defensibility and the timing of border tax adjustments. And I would note that none of the bills addresses exports, which is in fact an important consideration in international trade. Additionally, a border tax adjustment was going to require more information on the part of government about foreign companies and foreign countries. And this can be very difficult to obtain. And as has been noted by an earlier commentator, this could lead to trade wars. Let me, almost done, Mr. Chairman. Okay. Free allowance allocation is certainly a very attractive mechanism, particularly the output-based allocation that has been discussed here. It can address both import and export issues. The Inslee-Doyle approach is a very pragmatic mechanism for addressing this. I understand that some revisions are under consideration, and I'd be happy to answer questions on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Morgenstern, very much. Our final witness is Eileen Clausen. She is the president of the Pew Center on Global Climate Change, where she specializes in international issues. She is the former Assistant Secretary of State for Oceans and International Environmental and Scientific Affairs. Whenever you are ready, please begin.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Upton, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify. Addressing global climate change presents policy challenges at both the domestic and the international levels, and the issue of competitiveness underscores the very close nexus between the two. In the long term, a strong multilateral framework ensuring that all major economies contribute their fair share to the global climate effort is the most effective means of addressing competitiveness concerns. In designing a domestic climate program, the question before Congress is what to do in the interim until an effective global agreement is in place. A first step in addressing competitiveness is assessing the potential scope and magnitude of potential impacts. Our focus must be on energy-intensive industries whose goods are traded globally, such as steel, aluminum, cement, paper, glass, and chemicals. As heavy users of energy, these industries will face higher costs as a result of domestic greenhouse gas constraints. However, as the price of their goods are set globally, their ability to pass along these price increases is limited. To empirically quantify the potential magnitude of this competitiveness impact, the Pew Center commissioned an analysis by economists at Resources for the Future. This work, which we will be publishing shortly, analyzes 20 years of data in order to discern the historical relationship between electricity prices and production, consumption, and employment in more than 400 U.S. manufacturing industries. Our analysis found that at the price level studied, the projected competitiveness impacts, as well as the broader economic effects on energy-intensive industries, would be modest but not insignificant, and in our view, readily managed with a range of policy instruments. In a domestic cap-and-trade system, competitiveness concerns can be addressed in part through banking and borrowing and the use of offsets, which can help reduce the costs to all firms. However, other transitional policies may be needed to directly address competitiveness concerns for energy-intensive industries in the period preceding the establishment of an effective international framework. Allow me to mention a couple of options we would not recommend and then a few that we would. One option is to exclude vulnerable sectors from coverage under the cap-and-trade program. Exclusions, however, would undermine the goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions economy-wide and reduce the economic efficiency of a national greenhouse gas reduction program. They would also give exempted industries an economic advantage over non-exempt competitors and provide no incentive for improved performance. A second option is to try to equalize greenhouse gas-related costs for U.S. and foreign producers by imposing a cost or other requirement on energy-intensive imports from countries with weaker or no greenhouse gas constraints. Such measures, however, would apply only to imports to the United States and would not help level the playing field in the larger global market, which is where U.S. manufacturers compete. In addition, if the United States were to impose border requirements, there is a greater likelihood that it would become the target of similar measures. There is a significant risk that border adjustments would engender more conflict than cooperation, in the end making it more difficult to reach agreements that could more effectively address competitiveness concerns globally. The Pew Center believes that Congress should seek to address competitiveness concerns by strongly encouraging the executive branch to negotiate a new multilateral climate agreement establishing strong, equitable, and verifiable commitments by all major economies, and including in cap-and-trade legislation transitional measures to cushion the impact of mandatory greenhouse gas limits on energy-intensive, trade-exposed industries and the workers and communities they support. These transitional measures should be structured as follows. In the initial phase of a cap-and-trade program, allowances should be granted to vulnerable industries to compensate them for the costs of greenhouse gas regulation. For direct costs, allocation should be based on actual production levels. For indirect costs, allowances should reflect an emitter's production-based energy consumption, taking into account the greenhouse gas intensity of its energy supplies. Allocations should be set initially so a producer whose emissions intensity is average for the sector is fully compensated for regulatory costs, while those who are above or below average receive allowances whose values is greater or less than their cost respectively. This factor should be adjusted over time as an incentive to producers to continually improve their performance. This is similar to the approach proposed by Congressman Inslee and Doyle. Allowance levels should decline over time, gradually transitioning to full auctioning, although at a slower rate than for other sectors. A review should be conducted periodically to assess whether sectors are experiencing competitiveness impacts, and if warranted, to adjust allowance levels or the rate of transitioning to full auctioning. A portion of allowance auction revenue should be earmarked for programs to assist workers and communities in cases where greenhouse gas constraints are demonstrated to have caused dislocation. Transition assistance should be curtailed for a given sector upon entry into force of a multilateral or sectoral agreement establishing reasonable obligations for foreign producers, or upon a presidential determination that such measures have been instituted domestically. We believe this approach addresses the transitional competitiveness concerns likely to arise under a mandatory cap-and-trade program while maintaining the environmental integrity of the program and providing an ongoing incentive for producers to improve their greenhouse gas performance. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Clausen, very much. And that concludes our opening statements from the witnesses. We'll now turn to questions from the subcommittee members, and the chair will recognize himself for a round of questions. And I'm going to start with you, Mr. McMacken. And you, Mr. McBroom, is there a way in which we can reconcile the two approaches which you present? That is the free allocation approach, which Mr. Doyle and Mr. Inslee are proposing, or some border protection measures which are taken as well. Is there a way to do them in concert, sequentially? What would be your recommendation if they could be put together as complementary policies?
Mr. Chairman, our working group doesn't have a formal position on the border equalization provision, so I guess that means we don't have a formal position on the interface of the two. But let me say this, sort of as for myself at least, that I think it's reasonable to say that most people who would support doing both would say that there is a role for border equalization at least as a backup measure and as one of the weapons in the armamentarium of our negotiators. For instance, kind of as a necessity, the allowance grants takes priority because if we eliminate the cost differential at the source, there is no cost differential to be equaled at the border. But what if the allowances are inadequate? What if some future Congress decides to eliminate allowance grants? Well, then some believe that rather than let leakage proceed, which is unacceptable, that at that point consideration of a WTO compliant border equalization process, or at least negotiations that involve those, might be good policy.
Okay, Mr. McBroom.
Well, I want to begin by associating myself with the remarks of Mr. McMacken. I think we're in complete agreement. Both should be utilized. Both can be utilized. They serve complementary purposes, but somewhat different purposes. Some have noted the issue that the IBEW-AP approach would not deal with exports. A grant of free allowances would, in fact, accomplish that because you are providing a direct grant of allowances or a subsidy to industries that are impacted by competitiveness, and that helps solve both of those issues at the same time.
So let me get on to you, Ms. Clausen. Do you agree with that? Can they be made complementary as policies?
You could, but I'd like to take issue a little bit with what Mr. McMacken said about having all of these things in your quiver as you go and do an international negotiation. I think actually the border measures would have the opposite effect and make it very difficult to negotiate an international agreement. So I think if you're going to include them, they should absolutely be a last resort.
Okay, let me come back to Mr. McBroom. You heard what Ms. Clausen just said.
No, not entirely. I would make 2 points referencing both her comment and other comments that have been made by committee members. Recently, as Mr. Whitfield acknowledged, Chinese officials came into the United States and they have protested very loudly on 2 points. One is that they don't want a border adjustment mechanism. In that, I would say they protest too much. The fact that they're protesting as vigorously as they are would indicate that it is, in fact, effective leverage. Because at the same time, they're saying that they don't want to be held accountable for any of the emissions from any products that they make that export to the United States. So they want the jobs, they want the factories, they want the economic growth.
Mr. McBroom, let's come back to Ms. Clausen. What's your answer, Ms. Clausen?
Yeah, I mean, actually, it was a Pew Center event at which the Chinese Director General spoke.
Congratulations on having such an interesting event.
and I actually think it was misreported. I mean, they did raise the issue of their goods, but you know that this has been common in international negotiations. I mean, the Canadians raise it all the time. So they weren't actually making it as a proposal. They were just sort of making a point. So unfortunately, I think the AP story was slightly off.
And Mr. Ciccio, Ms. Clausen, suggests that we should wait to cap greenhouse gas emissions until we have a global agreement. What do you think of that approach?
I do not think we can get a global agreement unless we act first.
Mr. Morgenstern, do you agree with that?
Yes.
Yes. Mr. McMacken, do you agree with that?
Mr. Chairman, I think that we will be aided in getting a global agreement if we do an Inslee-Doyle type measure for this simple reason.
No, that's right. So you agree that it would be good if we pass something first before we begin to negotiate?
Our group is solely limited to working constructively on that provision.
That's great. Thank you. Mr. McBroom.
The most likely scenario is that Congress will pass something first, because I think it will be too difficult in a very short period of time to negotiate an international agreement that will include mandatory binding commitments on the large emitters in the developing world. The negotiation will simply take too long, so as a practical matter, in terms of chronology, you're most likely to see domestic legislation move first.
Great. Thank you, Mr. McBroom. My time has expired. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Upton.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to make a couple points. First, I want to talk a little bit about coal. And Mr. McBroom, I'm glad that you're here. Though you didn't say this specifically, it was in your testimony. I just want to reiterate it that China's coal use as a percentage of world consumption increased from about 20% in 1985, and it will almost double by the year 2025. We know that China is bringing online almost 2 new plants every single week. In fact, in 2006, China brought into service 90,000 megawatts of new coal-fired generating capacity, which amounts to 2 large coal-generating units every week, as I said. And we also know that emissions have increased by 80% since 1990, and they're projected to rise by another 65% by 2020. Now, it's my understanding that they have made some strides, and I think they're using low sulfur coal, but obviously they're not using carbon, the new technique that we'd like to see happen, carbon capture. And because we haven't developed the carbon capture technique fully yet, in this country, I don't think we brought a single new coal plant online in the United States at all last year. So what's happening is that they are imitating what we've done on coal. They have another, in all likelihood, of about 50 or 60 years probably of generating capacity with the current technology that we have. And obviously, that is one of the big reasons why they have become the #1 emitter in the world. Now, this statement that is in today's Wall Street Journal that's been referenced a couple times by my colleagues dating back to the conference earlier in the week. If other countries, this is from Secretary Chu, who says, quote, "If other countries don't impose a cost on carbon, then we will be at a disadvantage, and we would look at considering perhaps duties that would offset that cost," he says. Li Gao, a senior Chinese negotiator from the National Development and Reform Commission, told Dow Jones Newswires Monday that a carbon tax would be a, quote, disaster, would prompt a trade war, and wouldn't be legal under the WTO. And then he says this, in quotes, "It does not abide by the rule of the WTO, and secondly, it's not fair," end quote. adding that his delegation would relate China's concerns to U.S. officials. Now, as we look at manufacturing in this country and the charts in terms of the loss of jobs, we see what China is doing without real clean coal technology, and we see what I think will be a real migration of jobs, and will, as much as we'd like to say, well, we can use the WTO to make sure that they have to purchase offsets. We heard last year from Susan Schwab that, in fact, that would provide a real difficulty. And we see what the Chinese are saying. And furthermore, we had testimony last year. In India and China, neither one of them thought that they would really want to participate. So to me, it sounds a little bit like pie in the sky. I don't know how we achieve what we'd all perhaps like to see happen. And we just see a further migration of the jobs. And Mr. McKinnon, as a board member on OI, I don't know how much production is in this country. I know that OI has international facilities all around the world. And you're in the state of Ohio, 86% of your electricity comes from coal. So if you impose these burdens, and I don't know whether you have, I don't know Ohio all that well. I don't know if you have production in Ohio. Do you? OI?
We have some production in Ohio, yeah.
How much of that is, how much of a base in Ohio do you have in terms of total production that you've got? 20%, 50%?
No, we are about a third of our worldwide production is in the United States. Our major states of production are Pennsylvania and California.
And what will happen if we have something like this that will have a cap and trade and increase those costs, knowing in fact that, as we look at China, I think they're about, currently, if we send all those jobs there, they don't export all that much here, but it'll be a higher burden for us.
Mr. Upton, I'm from the little town of Brockway, Pennsylvania, which has 2 of these glass plants, and my main motivation is to give those people a fair level playing field to compete against foreign location suppliers. So I do agree, unless we do something that mitigates the cost that would be imposed on energy-intensive, trade-exposed industries like glass, that employment will suffer and jobs around the country, including in Brockway, Pennsylvania, will be at risk.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Doyle.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just say to my colleagues, I think we all accept the fact that if we implement a cap-and-trade system and don't put in some provisions in the bill to deal with issues of leakage or issue with coal-fired utility plants, of course, it's going to end up being a very expensive proposition, and jobs are going to be lost, and it's not going to be a good way to go, and we're going to pass a bill because I don't think many members will vote for a bill like that. What we're trying to do and what we're trying to learn more about today is how we can put provisions in the bill that deal with some of these issues so we don't have some of the things that we're afraid may happen if we do nothing. So it's the whole part of this hearing, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it, and I look forward to continuing to work with you on this bill. Mr. McBroom, thank you for your testimony today. I was glad to hear you say and to see that there's a widespread agreement on the panel that the border tax and the proposal that Jay and I have been working on are, don't compete with one another or are not mutually exclusive of one another. Both can be done, and one doesn't negate, the effects of the other. And I agree. I think we need as many weapons in the arsenal, so to speak, as we can. So I was happy to hear your testimony today. Mrs. Clausen, Mr. McMacken shared a report with us that's offering some suggestions as the best way to answer the eligibility question. What industry should or shouldn't be covered by this policy. What do you think about the energy-intensive trade exposures benchmarks that his report suggests? Have you had a chance to see it?
No, I'm sorry, I haven't had a chance to look at it. We will look at it, and I'd be happy to get back to you on what we think of it.
Thank you. And Mr. McMacken, we appreciate you saying that our proposal is a breakthrough, but we know we still have some more work to do, and probably this whole issue of eligibility of looking at these industries and these industry subsects, there's still a lot more work to be done, and we need some more data. But I look forward to seeing the report that you have on the subject. I haven't had a chance to read it yet either, but we're looking forward to do that. I wonder if, for the benefit of our colleagues here on the committee, if you could just take a moment and express to our colleagues here the process as you view it that helped lead us to this latest version of the proposal.
Mr. Doyle, I've been doing policy work in Washington for about 30 years, and the process on crafting to this point the energy-intensive foreign trade exposed relief provision has been as constructive as I have been engaged in. It's been transparent, it's been open and inclusive. We had the advantage, of course, that the leakage problem is every bit as much an environmental problem as it is an economic problem. Sure. So all stakeholders had a real incentive to solve it, and we have made very good progress because everyone has been able to engage in a constructive dialogue.
Thank you. And Mr. Morgenstern, I think your testimony also made a strong case for why certain industries face unique challenges of leakage and loss of competitiveness. And you talked a little bit about the free allocation, free allowance allocation as part of the solution to the problem. I just want to give you an opportunity, too, if you wish to expand on what you see as the strengths or weaknesses of our approach and how it could be improved.
Well, I think the idea that you have identified energy intensity and trade sensitivity as the key issues is absolutely right, and I commend that completely. I think in any of these approaches there are details that need to get sorted through, and there are major data issues, as you and others have referred to, that kind of limit the ability to have a very precise answer as we sit here. And presumably some additional information will be forthcoming in, for example, the EPA registry, which is forthcoming. I think the idea that Congress would ultimately give very precise guidance to the agencies is really important, and not leave this open to a great deal of discretion, because I think that can simply that can cause problems down the road.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. I'll yield back my time.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to acknowledge in the audience a former colleague and chairman of the Science Committee, Congressman Sherrod Boehlert of New York, a nemesis of this committee when he was on the Science Committee, but a good friend and an avid baseball player, so baseball fan. Mr. Chairman, I have two articles from today's papers I'd like to put into the record. The Washington Times article that headlines Obama Climate Plan could cost $2 trillion, and the Washington Post article, trade barriers could threaten global economy.
It sounds like two things we want in the record. So without objection, we'll include them.
Well, it's two things that need to be in the record, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you and the members of the committee allowing them to be in the record. Mr. McMakin, you talked about an efficiency standard in your testimony. Would you and your group support such a standard absent a mandatory cap-and-trade program?
Mr. Barton, I think that most of the members of the group would be very reluctant to. Efficiency standards are more in the nature of the command and control type regulation than the more market-oriented cap and trade. And we think that Mr. Inslee and Doyle have found a way to make it work within the context of an allowance grant of cap and trade, but that's a very different consideration in its absence.
Okay. Mr. Ciccio, you point out in your testimony that industrial emissions in the United States have only gone up about 2.5 or 2.6%, while residential, commercial, and transportation emissions have gone up between 27 and 29%. In your opinion, is it possible to cap and trade those parts of the economy that continue to go up more rapidly than the economy itself?
The question is, can we cap the other sectors?
Yes, sir.
Just those sectors?
Yes, sir. I mean, it seems sort of silly to cap industrial emissions when they're going up less than the rate of growth of the economy, but commercial, residential, and transportation are going up 10 times as rapidly. If you really want to cap it, that's where you have to do it, but I don't think you can do it.
No, capping all of those sectors wouldn't make sense in our view. That there are many, many very cost-effective ways to improve the efficiency and reduce the greenhouse gas emissions of those sectors without cap and trade. And the thing that we have to, as a country, continue to look towards in this important debate is cost effectiveness. And an economy-wide cap and trade approach is not necessarily, well, in our view, not cost effective. There are better ways.
Okay. Ms. Clausen, first let me say I enjoyed our dialogue at the Congressional Quarterly Breakfast. You're actually a very pleasant person. When you're not testifying, disagreeing with me on whatever the subject happens to be. My question for you, because we talked about it at the CQ breakfast, would the groups that you represent support meeting our electrical generation targets with natural gas plants, even though natural gas, when you consume it or burn it, it does create CO2. It just creates less CO2 than coal plants.
Well, I enjoyed our breakfast too, and you're a very nice person when you're not asking me hard questions. So,
that's my easy question.
First of all, I should clarify that I don't represent anybody other than the Pew Center. We work with lots of companies ourselves. We work within U.S. CAP, so we work with lots of companies.
Do they accept natural gas as an element of our electric
I think most would agree that natural gas could be a transition. Because, of course, it does result, I mean, burning natural gas does result in greenhouse gas emissions, but far less than coal. On the other hand, we are very sensitive to what we could call a dash for gas, because we really think coal is going to be part of our future.
We put you down as undecided on that? You could go either on the other. Well, anytime somebody answers a question on the other
hand,
then it's.
Look,
I've got one more question. I
just want to say there's no single solution here. You need all of it. We have to do carbon capture and sequestration. In my opinion, we have to do nuclear. We have to use gas. We have to do efficiency. I mean, we just need everything.
I'll take that as a yes. Dr. Thorning, can I ask one?
Please, yeah, please.
I tried to get it in before it went to zero, Mr. Chairman. I was starting to ask the question. So.
You were wasting a lot of time being gracious to each other, okay? And just stick to the subject.
I've learned that from you, though, Mr. Chairman. It's a good trick. Dr. Thorning, you go into some of the economic consequences of reducing our CO2 emissions below the 1990 baseline and other baselines. The Obama budget would reduce by the year 2020 emissions 14% below the 2005 baseline and 83% by the year 2050. I'm told if we adopt the Obama budget and actually meet those targets, by 2050 we will have an absolute emissions level in this country last seen in 1910 and a per capita emissions level last seen in this country in 1875. 1875. Do you think the American people would support those types of lifestyle changes to get those draconian reductions?
I think the American public would be reluctant to make the drastic changes in lifestyles that would be necessary under any of the major plans. In my testimony, I have a couple of charts, one of which shows the per capita emission reductions that would be required by 2020 and 2030 to comply with the Obama plan. The cutting emissions from an average of 23 tons per person right now down to approximately 18 by 2020 and down to perhaps 12 by 2030 would require the kind of changes that the American public simply would not go along with. So I think we need to be very cautious as we approach this issue, because if you can't sell it politically, it's just not going to happen.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate the time in the hearing. Let me first say, before I get into my questions, I'm concerned, Ms. Clausen, about the dash for gas also, but that's also because I have a chemical industry that provides a lot of jobs that's really in tough shape right now. But just for the panel, this is probably the last year, is the first year we've actually increased our production of domestically produced natural gas. There's been some great discoveries in the Gulf of Mexico, obviously in the shales in other parts of the United States. So there is a way that we can produce that and literally cut our emissions much down. And I understand the transitional phase, and that's true. But the transition may last a few years until our economy can absorb it. The other issue, I think, that if we do not have something like the Inslee-Doyle Amendment that's enforceable, I don't think we'll see cap and trade. I can't vote for it because I can't see a fake to the blue-collar workers of our country that we're really going to control not exporting your jobs. And again, coming from a blue-collar area that's refinery and chemical jobs, those products could easily be made in India or China. In fact, I had this discussion with a diplomat from India, and I said, you can't expect me to want to send my jobs to you while we're concerned about climate change. Whether it goes up in India or China or in Texas, it still creates carbon in our atmosphere. And so that's why that amendment, and as strong as possible, I think our country can provide leadership in climate change and still say this is the way we want to do it. And we haven't had that leadership for a number of years. And I would like to see the leadership, but I also want to make sure it goes in the right direction. Mr. Mackin, in your testimony, you state that a true cost-negating anti-leakage provision would address all indirect or other direct costs, and that the Inslee-Doyle approach would not compensate for cost increases on feedstocks or other inputs. Nor would it compensate for the demand and the demand curve caused increases in natural gas. I believe in all the higher costs contribute to the cost of competitiveness. Shouldn't a compensation program take these and other indirect cost impacts into account?
Congressman, it is true that the Inslee-Doyle provision would leave a significant gap in making up for these regulation-caused cost increases, and that does raise the risk of leakage, and that's one of the reasons that we're looking forward to continue to working with Congressman Doyle and Inslee and others on the provision to try and make sure we get that balance right.
So what percentage do you have an idea what we would need to cover those full indirect costs?
It's very difficult to know because the one you mentioned that is the most troublesome, the most difficult to measure, is that part of the increase in natural gas, which is not just a function of the allowances that need to be submitted for its combustion, but that part of the increase that increases because demand for it will go up and the demand curve will shift precisely because it is carbon advantage. It would be very difficult to know how to measure that.
Okay. Anyone else like to touch on that one before I go to another? Yes.
Yes, sir, I would. Increased natural gas demand and the resulting increase in the price of natural gas is only part of the increased cost. The fact is that across the country, natural gas-powered generation sets the marginal price for electricity. So as the price of natural gas goes up because of climate policy, that will help drive up the price of natural gas also. So actually, there's two impacts that are not accounted for in the Inslee-Doyle approach.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Morgenstern, in your testimony, you state that the hardest hit industry is by a carbon price signaler, chemicals, plastics, primary metals, non-metallic minerals, and that over the long term, you estimate that the leakage rate for the few most vulnerable industries could be as high as 40% in the case of the unilateral $10 per ton of CO2 price. At $10, you estimate a 40% leakage rate. The Obama administration estimates that carbon permits will sell for $20 on the average under their cap and trade proposal. How much would you estimate of leakage change under $20 per ton for the average carbon cost?
Congressman, we have actually not done that calculation. It might be somewhat higher, but it's certainly not double. I'm pretty sure of that. We're in the process of doing that analysis right now.
Okay. Appreciate any follow-up that you can provide to the committee. In your testimony, you state that under a unilateral policy that established a price on carbon dioxide emissions, a readily identifiable set of industries is at a greater risk of contraction over both the short and long term, and the hardest hit industry, petroleum refining, will likely be able to pass along most cost increases, thereby muting the impacts. On what statistics do you base your assertion that the refiners can pass through all their costs?
Well, Congressman, the principal statistic is the percentage of product which is imported. And as opposed to certain other industries which have a much higher percentage of their product imported, petroleum refining has a relatively small number. I don't have the actual number at my fingertips.
Okay. I would estimate that, I think I've heard numbers that 60% of our oil is imported. So does that seem right?
Well, Congressman, I think you have to distinguish between imported crude oil and finished product. And imported crude oil would be subject to the same charge as domestically produced crude oil. So there's not going to be any change in incentives on that side. It's strictly on the slightly additional cost of refining, because refining, as you well know, is an energy-intensive activity. Yeah. So that activity would be, there would be some additional costs associated with that. And they would not be completely able to pass them along, but given the small, relatively small percentage of product that's imported, they would be relatively protected.
As studied by the Near Economic Consulting on the impacts of Lieberman Warner on the refining sector states that the level of cost pass-through is highly uncertain, particularly in later years, since price increases depend upon the nature of increased costs, the level and nature of international competition, and other factors. One of these factors is the market, and the fact gasoline stations compete and consumers make choices based on a penny of difference per gallon. Given these realities and uncertainties, how can we be certain American refiners will be able to pass through all their costs? Won't competition for international products undermine the cost recovery to a certain extent? For example, higher carbon costs in U.S. relative to international sources of refined products could likely lower the pass-through of carbon cost.
Congressman, you are correct that they will not be able to pass through 100% of their costs. There will be some burden placed on domestic refineries. Compared to the other industries we studied, we believe it will be relatively small.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ryan, hold up the chart. What happens to these coal miner jobs in a cap-and-trade regime, Ms. Clausen?
If we can get carbon capture and sequestration up and running.
How long is that going to take us? What's the projections?
Well, there are lots of projections.
What's the shortest time projected?
Probably 10 years.
10 years. 10 years. What happens to these jobs if we don't have carbon capture and sequestration immediately? You know, the difference between the Clean Air Act amendments in '90 and now is that we could fuel switch or we had technology. Is there current technology to save these coal miner jobs?
I mean, I believe that the first thing that happens when you put a cap and trade in place is that people try to become more efficient, because that is the cheapest way.
But we have legislation called New Source Review that doesn't allow coal power plants to be efficient. In fact, it delays the implementation of more efficient generators with a permitting process that takes years.
Please don't ask me to talk about New Source Review.
Yeah. It's a failure of our policy, and of course, let me go. Anyone else want to answer the question, what happened to these jobs? Mr. Morgenstein?
Congressman, I guess I would note that in several of the analyses that have been done, I believe by the Energy and Information Administration, they find, and it does depend on scenario, you are correct, but they find that actual production, domestic production in 2020 is higher than it is today.
Do you know what happened to the state of Ohio when they passed the Clean Air Amendments in 1990? We had testimony of that last week. You know how many jobs they lost? 35,000. Dr. Thorning?
I'd like to mention that in Table 1 of my testimony, I do present various scenarios from EPA and EIA, including scenarios that we think are more realistic. Under EPA's scenario number 7, when they analyzed Lieberman Warner last year, they assumed slow growth of nuclear generating capacity. They assumed carbon capture and storage would not be available till at least the 2020 or 2025. And they found that there would be a significant...
I'm really running out of time. I got 3 more major issues.
So I think,
do we lose coal mining jobs?
Pardon?
Do we lose?
Significant number of coal mining jobs, and those are detailed in the ACCF
Mr. Ciccio?
study.
Sir?
Yes. An absolute correlation to your point I can relate to manufacturing, and that is that when energy prices went up in this country relative to the rest of the world, we lost 2 million manufacturing jobs in a period of less than 2 years.
Isn't that the intent of climate change legislation, to raise energy rates?
Yes.
It's President Obama's statement. Let me quote from the Washington Post, April 9th. Higher electricity rates are the intent of the whole exercise. If there were no effects, why should you have a cap-and-trade system? Now, when you address the manufacturing jobs, basically your testimony talks about the emission side. What is the job loss because of higher energy costs?
As I said, there is a direct correlation to the increased costs of natural gas and then electricity that started in 2000 to 2003. We lost 2 million manufacturing jobs just like that.
I'm not trying to be disrespectful, or I just don't have a lot of time. So higher energy costs relates to job loss. Does everyone agree with that? Yes, everybody's nodding yes. That's the intent of this administration and this legislation. Let me do another quote from President Obama. When President-elect at the time, he was a candidate. When I was asked earlier about the issue of coal, you know, under my plan of a cap-and-trade system, electricity rates would necessarily skyrocket. So we can talk about the carbon dioxide issue. We're talking about leakage of jobs. I'd love to engage in a debate. I ask you this question. From his inaugural address, we will harness the sun and winds and soil to fuel our cars and run our factories. Yes or no? Can we run a factory on wind and solar power?
I'm afraid not. Manufacturing...
Are we close to it?
Well, manufacturing needs reliable energy, and they run often 24/7 solar.
What is the percentage of electricity generated in this country today by renewables? Anyone know?
About 3% if you don't count hydro.
If you don't count hydro, 3%. So if we doubled to 6, that would be a dramatic gain. We will have massive job loss, massive job dislocation, and I challenge the Democrats to move this bill, because we will defeat them at the polls. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Washington State, Mr. Inslee.
Well, I just want to say I'd always welcome my good friend Mr. Shimkus coming and challenging me in the 1st District in the state of Washington. I'll just bring that on, as they say, but that's another matter. Dr. Thorning, I want to ask, we are comparing in any economic analysis 2 scenarios, one an action scenario based on a cap-and-trade bill, one an inaction scenario where we don't respond to climate change. In your assessment, what assumption did you make about the jobs that will be lost in the inaction scenario where we do not, as a result of the significant changes to the climate in the United States? What assumption did you make?
It's an excellent question, and I'd like to draw you back to the figure in my testimony showing the impact on global concentrations of CO2 at the end of this century if we do adhere to the Lieberman-Warner targets, for example, and the rest of the world does not adopt strict targets.
Could you, let me excuse you just for a minute. I only have 5 minutes. Could you just answer the question? What assumption did you make about the job losses that would be caused by climate change if the U.S. Congress sits on its hands and doesn't do something about climate change? What assumption did you make? How many jobs would be lost by the inaction scenario? Just give me a number or a percentage, please.
We did not specifically look at jobs lost due to inaction because climate change is a global problem. It really doesn't matter what the U.S. does because our emissions are an ever-shrinking share. The point is, how many jobs will be lost if we move down a cap and trade or even a tax proposal? Because each 1% of GDP is accompanied by a 0.3% increase.
I appreciate your answer because I think it exposes a titanic flaw in your assessment of this problem. There's two choices America can make. It can decide not to act on this and have massive job losses in the agricultural economy, massive job losses in the sectors that depend on water, because our snowpack's not going to be in the Cascade, which is feeding our hydroelectric system, which feeds the Boeing manufacturing plant relatively inexpensive electricity, massive job losses in a whole host of areas. The Stern report indicates it will be 5 times any job losses associated with action on global warming. And your assessment, you're coming in here and telling us we're going to have job loss, when any assessment says we're going to have more job loss that's been done, the only assessment that I've seen, in the course of the globe not responding to climate change. Now, I find that stunning that an economist would come in here and not compare apples to apples in this regard. Now, do I take it that the reason you didn't do that is you thought that because this is a global problem, it just doesn't matter in the U.S., or just ignore it? That's pretty much your assessment, right?
The point of my testimony is that it is a global problem, and even if the U.S. were to hit the targets in the Lieberman-Warner proposal, the administration's own analysis shows it won't matter.
Well, let me just say
we need to think about maintaining economic growth so that we can develop the technology to capture and store.
I have hardly ever heard a more defeatist statement in this hearing that we're just going to let the world go burn, and because we can't solve it alone, we should not do anything. That, I would assert, is not the American act of leadership. There was something that a couple other the witnesses talked about that I'm not sure I fully understood that may be a virtue of the one of the approaches that Mike and I have suggested. And I don't mean to get into a contest between border adjustment or what Mike and I have proposed, because they may be complementary. But I do want to make sure I understand something a couple of witnesses talked about. The approach that Mike and I have suggested would give a benefit on the export side of the economy. In other words, it would give a benefit to our manufacturers as they export product because they would get this benefit of a free allowance. Do I understand correctly that a trade adjustment, at least to the extent that I've seen them proposed, would not give that benefit on the export side? It would give them a benefit by protecting against imports, competitive imports, but would not give a benefit to our exports, which also have to compete internationally outside of our domestic markets. Is that a correct assessment?
Mr. Inslee, it is. We view that as one of the critical advantages of the Inslee-Doyle type allowance grant. The problem is a WTO prohibition on export rebates. There is some talk of trying to design one that is WTO compliant, but I'm certainly not an expert on that.
Anyone else disagree with that assessment at all? Thank you. Thank you very much.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Pitts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Sisio, China's top climate negotiator Monday said any fair international agreement on emissions reduction should not require China to reduce emissions caused by goods it exports to other countries. This doesn't sound like China wants to play by our self-imposed rules. What evidence do we have that we can convince China to go along if we make our industries less competitive?
Congressman, that's exactly why we have, our testimony has taken the approach that it has, is that cap and trade is not a viable policy option for the industrial sector in developing countries, nor is it good for us. A better approach that all industrial companies around the world understand is productivity. They can control the efficiency,
They can control improve the electricity improvement in their plant, the natural gas improvement, or whatever fuel, but they can improve the yield, but it's very, very difficult for them to reduce absolute quantities. There is no movement on the part of the Chinese that we've seen that they will accept a cap and an absolute reduction for the industrial sector. This is why we need to jumpstart negotiations across all developed and developing countries to deal with explicitly the industrial sector from a trade and from a productivity standpoint.
Dr. Thorning, a lot of the policy discussion about effectiveness of cap and trade is derived from large integrated models of the economy and international markets. It involves model-based analysis of what we might expect if the United States and all nations work together to reduce emissions. Do these modeling exercises represent what happens in the real world?
That's an excellent point, Congressman, and I think we need to take account of the reality of politics. For example, stepping back and looking at China, China buys a huge portion of U.S. debt. They're funding our lack of saving. If we impose a border tax adjustment on Chinese and other imported goods, there might be some reluctance on the part of the Chinese to continue to invest in the U.S. So I think we need to look at climate policy as a whole and look how moving one part of our economy through, say, border tax adjustments might impact other parts of our economy. I think the models that have been developed simply do not recognize political reality. We don't have the ability to enforce international agreements. We've been working on this for some 20 years, trying to evolve that type of agreement. It hasn't come about, and according to a recent study by Lee Lane and David Montgomery, it's unlikely to. We're going to have to depend on technology. We're going to have to depend on new technology, new nuclear, carbon capture and storage if we want to continue to grow our economy as well as reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So I think the models that have been developed simply are not reflective of reality.
Dr. Thorning, what, in a nutshell, is the European industry doing to cope with its cap and trade system, and how does this compare with what the U.S. will face?
Well, the experiment in the European Union, they've had an ETS since 2005, shows that they don't have the political will to tighten down emissions to actually hit their Kyoto target. Without strong new measures, the EU is unlikely to meet their Kyoto target because they've exempted large sectors of their economy and haven't covered enough facilities. Their new plan, their 2020 by 20 reduction, is unlikely to be enforced because it would require significantly higher taxes. The only way Europe will meet their new targets is through economic collapse.
Ms. Clausen, should we be concerned about a trade war if we impose tariffs on countries that don't take action on greenhouse gas emissions? Would a trade war have implications for our relationship with China and other arenas, such as working to improve China's record on human rights or China's relationship with Tibet?
We do not like trade wars. We do not like border adjustment measures. So I think if you're going to use them, they should absolutely be a last resort, and we should do everything else before we get there.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Right, gentleman's time has expired, and we will end the hearing by recognizing Mr. Scalise from Louisiana for a round of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll try to run through them quickly since the vote is going on right now on the floor. Mr. Morgenstern, in your testimony you had stated, and I'll quote this, within the manufacturing sector, the hardest hit industries are chemicals and plastics, primary metals, and non-metallic minerals. Another hard-hit industry, petroleum refining, will likely be able to pass along most cost increases, thereby muting the impacts. When you talk about muting those impacts, clearly if they're passing them on, who are they then passing them on to, and who would actually get that impact if they didn't get the impact?
Congressman, they would pass along the impacts in the form of higher prices, which in turn will enter into consumers' and businesses' calculations about their choice of technologies, new vehicles, et cetera.
Any estimates on how much that would be, how much would be passed on to consumers, let's say when somebody goes to fill up their gas tank, how much more they will pay, or when they go to the grocery store, how much more will they pay?
Yeah, I don't have a number at my fingertips, but it would be a very high proportion of the actual cost of the allowances would be passed forward to the consumers.
And I've seen reports that show up to $3,000 per American family in increased costs due to these pass-throughs, whether it be from electricity bills going up because the utility companies would be able to pass those costs on, or the energy-related products that would also be able to be passed on. And in fact, Mr. Orsag, the President's budget director, himself acknowledged that that there would be increased costs to consumers because of these. So I guess
Congressman, my colleague Dallas Bertraw, who is not here today, has actually done an extensive study on this question, and there clearly will be higher costs to consumers and to households across the country, and it will vary somewhat by region. And part of the some of the provisions in the legislation presumably would attempt to compensate for those losses.
Yeah, and obviously that concerns a lot of people. Ms. Clausen, if you could real briefly hit on that.
Yeah, I mean, there is a wide range. It depends on the model you use. Some of them are as low as $200 per household per year. Some of them are as high, as you pointed out, as $3,000 per household per year. I think the most important thing to do is to make sure that there are no price spikes or really high prices for consumers, which you can do by making sure that there are allowances for local distribution companies who provide electricity.
Yeah, and I think we've seen that there are some proposals to exempt certain people, which, of course, under the President's budget, he expects to generate $640 billion in new taxes from this proposal, so that would actually put an even higher disproportionate share. We use the teacher married to the police officer. That married couple would then almost see a doubling if you exempt lower income earners, because that couple would earn about $80,000, and so that teacher married to the police officer would not appreciate the fact that they're considered rich under these proposals and would have to pay maybe $5,000 more. But I've only got about a minute left, and I apologize for that, Mr. Ciccio. You had talked about U.S. industries working on efficiencies for decades. We've seen people cutting back, businesses cutting back. Are there more effective policies that can help foster innovation to provide that next generation of energy efficiency other than this tax policy, taxing the
manufacturing is very energy efficient, but there's always this constant effort. We need good tax policy, faster depreciation. We certainly need the removal of regulatory barriers and financial barriers to utilizing, for example, combined heat and power and waste heat. These are all very positive incentives that would be very helpful to the sector.
And final question, how's regulatory policy such as decoupling electricity rates actually affected your industries?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question, because decoupling separates volume from price. And manufacturing needs a return on investment to invest in energy efficiency with the objective, of course, of reducing the amount of, for example, electricity that it would consume. But when you decouple, okay, there is all of a sudden a lack of incentive, financial incentive to invest, because the prices will not go down.
And that's all I have. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired, and the all time for this hearing has expired. We thank this panel very much. Obviously, in any legislation which we draft, we are going to need to deal with those industries that are most affected, especially from a trade perspective, from a climate policy which we adopt, and we intend on doing that. We thank this panel very much, and we would like to stay in close contact with you as we're moving along the legislative process. This hearing is adjourned.
Thank you very much. Good job. You know an old college shop.